When an empath finally walks away from a narcissist, they don't celebrate. They don't run into the world, searching for new company or new conversations. They vanish. They go quiet. They stay home. They retreat from noise like a wounded soul, searching for oxygen. To outsiders, it looks like exhaustion, like strange, sudden silence. But inside, something far deeper is happening. A psychological, spiritual, and unconscious reset that few people ever understand. Because no empath who has loved a narcissist walks back into the world with their heart still whole. The gaslighting, the emotional starvation, the constant confusion, the invisible wounds, they push the empath's nervous system to its breaking point. And when that storm finally ends, the soul steps into what Carl Jung called the withdrawal into the self, an ancient healing ritual where the psyche pulls its energy inward to recover what was stolen. Silence becomes their first medicine. Solitude becomes their first doorway back home. Not home as in four walls, but home as in the core of who they are, the part they lost while loving someone who fed on their light. They stay home, not because they fear the world, but because for the first time in a long time, they can hear themselves again. For months, maybe years, the narcissist occupied every corner of their inner world. Their thoughts, their emotions, their intuition, even their identity. The empath became a silent performer in a theater of chaos, bending, adjusting, apologizing, shrinking. So when they finally escape, the first thing their soul does is close the door, dim the noise, and whisper, "Come back to me." This silence is not weakness. It's cleansing. It's purification. It's the beginning of an inner rebirth. Hit subscribe and begin the journey back to your true self. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the body can no longer carry the weight of unspoken fears, hidden tension, and the constant emotional scanning that becomes second nature around toxic people. It doesn't happen with a warning. It doesn't happen with a loud collapse. It happens quietly, the way a dam finally gives way after years of pressure. Modern psychology calls this moment protective shutdown, a biological survival mode that activates when the emotional threat has been happening for too long. But for empaths, this shutdown is not just biological, it is spiritual. Their nervous system so finely tuned that it feels every shift in a room, every tone, every unspoken intention collapses under the heaviness of carrying everyone's emotions but their own. Suddenly, even small things become overwhelming. A sound, a change in someone's tone, a memory that flashes for a second. The body reacts as if danger is still present, even when the narcissist is gone. It's not madness, it's the body remembering where it has been. And so the empath retreats. Home becomes more than four walls. It becomes a sanctuary, a shield, a soft cave where their soul can breathe again. Here, they don't have to decode moods. They don't have to read micro-expressions. They don't have to perform emotional CPR for people who never appreciated it. In this space, the empath removes the armor they have worn for years, often without even knowing it was there. Their shoulders drop. Their breath deepens. The nervous tension that lived inside their body like a coiled wire finally loosens. For the first time in years, their soul stops bracing for impact. And when that biological silence finally settles, something deeper begins, something Jung spoke of with great reverence. He called it sacred regression, not regression as in going backwards, but regression as in returning to the inner world, the empath abandoned while trying to survive the outer world. The soul pulls back its energy from everyone and everything. It withdraws not because it is weak, but because it wants to speak to itself again. It seeks solitude the way a wounded animal seeks the forest, not to disappear, but to heal. Slowly, the qualities the narcissist fed on begin to return home. The kindness that was drained, the patience that was exploited, the intuition that was mocked, the depth that was dismissed, all of it begins flowing back into the empath, like rivers finding their way to the ocean they belong to. At first, this process feels like emptiness, a hollow space where the old self used to be. Then, a trembling starts inside the heart. Then comes the rising of old emotional fragments, surfacing from the subconscious. Guilt, shame. I'm too sensitive. I'm never enough. All the lies the narcissist planted bloom like dark flowers, not to poison the empath again, but to be noticed and released. And in that quiet, something miraculous happens. The empath finally realizes how much of themselves they lost trying to be loved by someone who never knew how to love. The silence becomes a mirror. It reflects every forgotten boundary, every abandoned desire, every swallowed tear, every version of themselves they sacrificed to keep the peace. This is the phase where the empath sees the truth that noise, chaos, and manipulation always kept hidden. They were never too much. They were never too sensitive. They were simply carrying more than any human was ever meant to carry. And now, in this silence, they begin to return to themselves. There comes a moment in an empath's healing journey when silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like truth. At first, it was a hiding place, a soft cave, where they escaped the chaos and noise that once drained them. But slowly, something begins to shift. The silence that once felt hollow begins to breathe. It becomes alive, almost intelligent, almost sacred. And it is inside this quietness that the empath begins to hear something they had ignored for years: their intuition. Not the loud, dramatic intuition people describe in movies. No, this one is soft, subtle, precise. It rises slowly, like warm smoke from the ashes of burnout. It doesn't shout, it whispers. But its whisper is clearer than any voice they heard in the relationship. This is the moment Jung described as the wisdom of the unconscious, the deep knowing that sits beneath all the noise of the world, waiting for silence so it can finally speak. And now, for the first time in years, the empath can hear it. In this silence, clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from knowing, a knowing that appears almost instantly, like a sudden light turning on in a dark room. They begin to see the relationship with new eyes, eyes unclouded by hope, fantasy, or the need to be loved. And the truth rises to the surface with painful precision. The manipulation, the cycles, the emotional theft disguised as affection, the way kindness was used against them, the way apologies were replaced with blame, the way love was replaced with control. And then a realization hits them with the cold clarity of morning light. The truth was always there. They were simply never silent enough to see it. Because silence is not empty, it is a magnifying glass. And in this magnified quietness, the empath sees the patterns they once excused, the red flags they once rationalized, the wounds they once minimized. This silence begins reshaping them from the inside out. Their energy, which once flowed outward like a river trying to nourish everyone else, begins flowing inward. It moves back into their body, their mind, their soul. Slowly, they form a new center, a place within themselves that feels stable, grounded, and unshakable. Here, they begin learning something powerful. They have the right to choose again. Who deserves access? Who doesn't? Who is safe for their spirit? Who only approaches them to feed on their empathy? These questions no longer come from fear. They come from clarity, from self-respect, from the quiet wisdom rising inside the silence. And the longer the empath stays in this silent phase, the more profound the realization becomes. They no longer fear solitude. Solitude, once something they avoided, now feels like freedom. Being alone no longer feels like abandonment, it feels like alignment. Silence becomes a language they understand better than words. And then, the most surprising transformation happens. They no longer fear themselves. They can sit with their thoughts without drowning. They can hear their emotions without breaking. They can witness their old wounds without collapsing. Silence, once a refuge, transforms into a rebirth chamber. Inside this sacred stillness, the empath is not fading away. They are reforming, rebuilding, reclaiming the parts of themselves they lost in the chaos. And slowly, a new version of them begins to emerge. One who is no longer driven by fear, by survival, or by the desperate need to be understood, but by intuition, by self-respect, by inner truth. This is where the rebirth begins. From the outside, nothing dramatic seems to be happening. To others, it looks simple. They stay home. They withdraw. They don't talk as much. They avoid noise, chaos, and unnecessary interaction. People might think the empath is merely tired, hiding, or taking a break. But inside, Something enormous is happening. Something sacred. Something that cannot be understood by anyone who has never walked through the fire of emotional trauma. Because in this stillness, the soul begins the ancient process of reassembling itself. Pieces that were scattered across years of giving. Pieces that were taken by manipulation. Pieces that the empath abandoned to keep the peace. All begin floating back into place. This is not a breakdown. It is a reformation. Old boundaries, the ones they once compromised, softened, or erased, begin to return like steel walls rising from the earth. Boundaries that once felt mean or too harsh now feel natural, necessary, protective. Old wounds begin rising to the surface, not to torment them, but to be seen. Wounds from childhood, wounds from past relationships, wounds they ignored because they were always busy caring for others. Even the illusions begin breaking apart. The illusion that they had to earn love. The illusion that kindness would change toxic people. The illusion that loyalty would be reciprocated. The illusion that sacrificing themselves was noble. These illusions fall like broken glass, quietly, painfully, beautifully. And then comes the moment every true empath eventually faces. They must confront their shadow. Not the shadow narcissists projected on them, but the real shadow. The inner darkness Jung spoke about. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And in the quiet of their room, with no one else around, the empath finally dares to look. They see the fears that shaped their choices. Fear of abandonment that made them cling to people who didn't deserve them. Fear of conflict that made them swallow their truth. Fear of losing someone that made them lose themselves. Fear of repeating childhood pain, so they tolerated what was familiar instead of what was healthy. They see the childhood roles they carried into adulthood, the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the emotional sponge, the responsible one. They see the emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. This is not punishment. This is purification. This is not destruction. This is rebirth. Slowly, something begins shifting inside their mind and heart. Their intuition becomes sharper than it has ever been. They no longer ignore the soft warnings they once dismissed. They no longer explain away the subtle discomfort they used to overlook. Their emotional system, once overloaded and overstimulated, begins to reset. Like a forest healing after a wildfire, peace begins growing where chaos once lived. Peace is no longer something they fight for. It becomes the air they breathe. And as days pass in this quiet ritual of solitude, something miraculous happens. They begin feeling safe in their own presence. Not lonely, not abandoned, not isolated. Safe in their own thoughts. Safe in their own emotions. Safe in their own energy. This safety is something a narcissist never wanted them to discover. Because an empath who feels safe in their own soul is an empath who can no longer be controlled. When solitude becomes a ritual, the empath becomes untouchable. They rise with a new identity, clearer, stronger, and no longer available for emotional predators. This is the rebirth the silence was preparing them for. There is a specific moment in an empath's healing journey that cannot be described with ordinary language. It doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music. It comes quietly like dawn, slipping through a window after a long, sleepless night. This is the moment the empath finally meets themselves. For so long, silence felt like emptiness, a space where pain echoed and loneliness wrapped itself around their chest. But slowly, through all the layers of solitude, they discover the truth. Silence was never isolation. It was a reunion, a sacred homecoming, a return to the self they abandoned while trying to love someone who loved only themselves. They begin seeing the versions of themselves they had forgotten. The child who once felt too responsible. The teenager who swallowed emotions to avoid being a burden. The adult who softened every boundary to be loved. And instead of rejecting these versions, they welcome them. They sit with them. They listen. This is where healing deepens. They learn how to sit with their pain without collapsing under it, something they never believed was possible. Instead of running, they breathe. Instead of escaping, they observe. Instead of drowning in memories, they float above them with calm understanding. They begin revisiting old moments, not to relive them, but to reclaim themselves from them. The memory that once felt like a storm now feels like a lesson. The wound that once felt unbearable now feels like a doorway. The fear that once controlled them now feels like an echo losing its power. In this stillness, power returns, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the subtle, grounded, unshakable kind that grows from deep self-awareness. They stop reacting out of fear. They stop responding to old triggers with old habits. Their nervous system no longer leaps at every shadow. Instead, they respond with clarity, with the wisdom that comes from finally understanding what they deserve. They stop chasing people who weren't walking toward them. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop shrinking to make others comfortable. The world hasn't changed. They have. Their presence becomes steady. Their energy becomes whole. They become self-sufficient in a way that feels both powerful and peaceful. Stillness, once frightening, becomes sacred. Solitude, once painful, becomes rich. Their own company, once avoided, becomes enough. And what they find within themselves is something they never expected. Comfort, strength, clarity, compassion, truth. They begin realizing that the love they were begging for from the outside was always supposed to grow from the inside. And then, in the gentlest way, something profound happens. They no longer crave the narcissist's validation. They no longer feel the urge to explain themselves. They no longer fear losing someone who was never truly theirs. They see the narcissist for what they were, a lesson, not a destiny, a catalyst, not a soulmate. And in that exact moment, the narcissist loses all power over them, not because the empath is angry, not because they seek revenge, not because they shut the door with bitterness, but because they no longer need anything from the person who once controlled them. They have returned to themselves. They have come home. What once felt like heartbreak now feels like liberation. What once felt like loss now feels like freedom. What once broke them has now reshaped them into someone wiser, deeper, and stronger. This is the quiet awakening, the moment an empath becomes someone no manipulator can ever reach again. There is a moment in the empath's journey when the healing becomes undeniable, not because of something dramatic, not because of a grand breakthrough, but because their inner world finally feels like home again. This is the final stage, what Jung called the restoration of essential energy. It is the quiet but powerful return to the self. In this stage, silence transforms once again. What was once protection becomes creation. What was once escape becomes empowerment. What was once a desperate refuge becomes a chosen sanctuary. Solitude no longer feels like being alone. It feels like being aligned. The empath realizes that home is not just a place. It is a state of being, a spiritual sanctuary where their truth can breathe without fear. They begin gathering the lost pieces of themselves, one by one. Pieces scattered across years of emotional labor, pieces left behind in arguments, apologies, and moments where they abandoned themselves to keep someone else whole. Pieces that were taken from them by manipulation, guilt, and emotional theft. They collect these fragments gently, lovingly, without judgment, and for the first time, they see how much of themselves they had given away, not because they were weak, but because their love was deep. The empath begins to understand something profound. Happiness was never outside of them. It was never in another person, another relationship, another validation. Happiness was always in the ability to sit with themselves and feel safe. And now, they finally do. They rebuild slowly, in rituals so soft that the world might overlook them. Gentle mornings with quiet breathing, tea sipped without rushing, soft rain tapping on windows like a lullaby. A room filled with peace instead of tension. A mind no longer scanning for danger. A heart no longer bracing for betrayal. No one draining their energy. No one claiming their emotions. No one owning their peace. This is the beauty of the return. Silence is no longer survival. It becomes identity. The empath begins to understand their worth in a way they never had before. They no longer ask, "Why am I not enough?" They now ask, "Who is not worthy of me?" They no longer wonder what they did wrong. They now see clearly who never deserved access to their soul. They learn, with quiet certainty, who should be allowed near their spirit, and who should never, ever be permitted again. Boundaries become effortless, not walls, but clarity. Intuition becomes louder, not warnings, but guidance. Peace becomes natural, not fought for, but lived. And then comes the moment of emergence. After months of silence, healing, and rebuilding, the empath finally steps back into the world. But they do not return as the version the narcissist broke. That version is gone forever. They return as the version they were always meant to become: whole, conscious, intuitive, awakened, rooted in truth, full of inner authority no one can manipulate. Their energy is clean, untouched by guilt. Their heart is steady, protected by wisdom. Their soul is restored, united with itself again. The narcissist's power evaporates like smoke in sunlight, not because the empath fought back, not because they proved anything, but because they finally outgrew the wound that once made them vulnerable. This is the real ending, or rather, the real beginning, because their silence was never the collapse. It was the doorway. It was never the death of who they were. It was the birth of who they were always meant to become: reborn, whole, untouchable, returned to themselves.